So it's really a pleasure to get to share my research here tonight. I'm a fan of this series, so it's a little surreal to be sitting up here rather than where you were sitting as well. And we just, yes, okay, the first hurdle is over. I can use the remote. And so I'm going to share the last chapter, the 6th chapter of my book tonight. And I want to start by giving you a little bit of context of where this comes from and what it is the culmination of in my project. And so my question was, what does New York City's history look like if we leave Manhattan Island behind? New York is a 5-borough city. It is over just about 300 square miles, and Manhattan 22 square miles of that. So you can see Manhattan here framed by the Hudson River, imagining us down here at the tip. And so I was curious about what happens in the history of urbanization between 1840 and 1940 if we get outside Manhattan. That Manhattan is very crucial to the engines of growth and the positions of power and finance that make New York, but it's only a fraction of it. And so I looked to the edges. And as someone who grew up on Long Island Sound in Connecticut, I was used to this as a coastal space. And I thought, how do we understand this city as a city linked by water? It is an archipelago, right? It's a city across multiple islands. And so I started to look at the Upper East River as connective tissue for greater New York. And so when I think about New York City's coastal periphery, I think about the East River. And so coming from here all the way up through Long Island Sound, because the East River is not a river, it is a tidal strait. This is a single ecological body. And so I approached it in that way. And my project moves through the East Bronx and Flushing and Steinway in Queens, out to Nassau County, up through Westchester. But today, I'm going to focus on that's the hubris of a graduate student. We should do it all in a single project. It will be fun and easy, I thought, 10 years ago. So today we're going to focus on just a little corner of this. We're going to focus on Flushing Meadows and Flushing Bay. It's particularly fun for me to share this research because now I'm at Queens College and I get to sit in traffic and think about Flushing Meadows. Today, in fact, I got to do that on my way back from work. And so this is a story that starts for us tonight, in the early 20th century, and starts with the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company. This is the company that dumped refuse across Flushing Meadows in the north central section of Queens and the north central section of the Meadowlands during the early 1900s. And it turned the marsh that adjoins Flushing Bay, you can see right here, into a mile-wide, 3-mile-long eyesore. There's smoldering refuse burned brightly at night, and sooty clouds frequently shrouded this area. Along the western side, no, eastern side, there's railroad yards and a jumble of automotive junk shops. This is a place you might know because F. Scott Fitzgerald writes about it. In 1925, he describes the Meadows as a desolate area of land where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. So Fitzgerald's Valley of the Ashes was the city's most conspicuous wasteland. In fact, when he was considering the title for The Great Gatsby, he considered entitling it Among the Ash Heaps and the Millionaires, because of the ash heaps here, and then of course the millionaires out here in his metaphorical East End. The Valley of the Ashes separated western Queens from the celebrated beauty of Nassau's Gold Coast. But in late June in 1936, city officials and reporters went out and braved this territory, and they gathered in the Ash Removal Company's dump for the launching of a redevelopment program, and it's that program I want to talk about today. LaGuardia is mayor at the time, so Fiorello LaGuardia is there. He gets up into the seat of a steam shovel, takes his photo at the throttle, and ceremonially claws in to a 10-foot butte of ash. The photographers who come to see him have to kind of clamber up the side of the ash, and it's stinky because it's June, and they're digging into this trash dump brings out decades worth of ripening trash. The highest mound in this space, and this is the Valley of the Ashes that we're looking at. This is the coastline along Flushing Bay, and you can see the ridges of the ash. Towers 100 feet tall, and it's nicknamed Mount Corona. And it towers above the crowd, but it's not going to tower for very long. The year 1939 is going to promise the dawn of a new day. This is where the World's Fair is slated to rise. So it's the 1930s, and New York City is trapped in the doldrums of the Depression, New York City and the nation, and it's an uncertain time. But there's a cohort of business leaders and civic leaders in New York who want to, they claim, reinvigorate national morale. They also want to reinvigorate the local economy, which is their economy. And so in contrast to a dreary present, they plan to present a fair, a bright and hopeful vision of the future, and a vision of profits for New York City. And so to achieve this goal, a group of influential leaders, their business magnates, urban planners, and municipal officials join together and organize a powerful nonprofit, the New York World's Fair 1939, Inc. And this is done in October of 1935. The corporation's representative is former Manhattan Borough President and head of the Regional Plan Association, George McKendy. And he knows who to ask about building this fair, and that's Robert Moses. He goes to the city's Parks Commissioner, Robert Moses, and says, "We want to build a fair." And Moses seizes on this venture as a means to fund Flushing Meadows development. He had first identified this area as potential parkland in 1930, and we'll talk about it, but he's been frustrated in his attempts to build a park here. And some of you might know, there's nothing better than a frustrated Robert Moses for good archival material. And so he has dedicated the city's Parks Department to renovating and modernizing the waterfront, and this fair would further empower Moses to unite shoreline redevelopment with his road and park building programs. This is the proposed fair site here. So Manhattan, New Jersey, and then Flushing Bay coming into play. The World's Fair is a touchstone for 1930s New York. It unites New Deal public works, local ambitions of the outer boroughs, and a growing trend of suburban decentralization, in fact. The Fair Corporation is very self-aware that it represents city building and imaginative city building. It declared that the construction of the fair itself contributed to the modern world of tomorrow. And that makes, I think, this history more significant. The corporation said, quote, "Its scope, its implications, and its results were a great public works project that would secure New York's position as the forefront of modern metropolitan planning." The official theme of the fair is building the world of tomorrow, just in case you didn't get it. And it captured particularly well the overarching city building that would crystallize in the decade preceding the fair and would be needed to turn this marshland into a fair site. What I see happening here is a weaving together of infrastructure, both environmental infrastructure in terms of sewerage and coastal redevelopment and land making, but also technological infrastructure of highways. And the fair is written about a lot because of its modernist and futurist theme. It's the first place that New Yorkers and Americans are introduced to nylon, to color film, to air conditioning for the first time on a large scale. But even with a futurist theme, this fair, I think, is grounded in the very real contemporary forces of land use planning and urban infrastructure and engineering that the very long progressive era, and if you don't believe in a very long progressive era, then at least the New Deal represent in New York City. And so my interest in this fair was thinking about how local public works in Queens and regionally scaled public works knit the edges of New York closer together in the 1930s and marked a new chapter both in the history of Queens but in the way that World's Fairs were imagined in this area. Because I should note, this is the last of 7 1930s World's Fairs, so it's not remarkable in and of itself, but what ends up happening, I think, is worth looking at. Okay. This is a unique moment of redevelopment for Queens, and it brings collaboration from scientists and designers and planners and businessmen and officials from nearly every level of government, from the Queens Borough of Sewers to New Deal agencies. And Robert Moses becomes the point man for all of the work connected to the fair. It's a powerful role that he makes possible through overlapping appointments. Since 1934, Moses had well, 1935, let's do TBA as well. He had chaired simultaneously the New York State Parks Commission, the Long Island State Parks Commission, the New York City Department of Parks, and the Triborough Bridge Authority. This makes him a powerful man. On top of that, he is going to write a 4-year lease between the World's Fair Corporation and the city. And when he writes this lease, he gives the Parks Department, and thus himself, the power to vet all fair construction. He also puts the general superintendent of the Parks Department, a man named Andrews, as general manager of the fair. So it is going to be under his thumb, and it is a window into his pre-war vision of New York City. The World's Fair that goes up between 35 and 39 is a window into the last of many attempted transformations of Flushing Meadows. Until the first decades of the 20th century, this immense meadow, which is 1.5 times the size of Central Park, remains largely in its natural state. And so this is the Meadowland here, and then this is Flushing Bay. At one point, these were both one and the same, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Flushing Bay here is edged by a bar of hard material that impedes tidal progress from Long Island Sound and East River, where the tides are coming from the Sound here, into this marshland. And it allows the accumulation of silt in what was once a former inner harbor. And it forms this 1,000-acre U-shaped marsh. This is the natural drainage basin for this section of Queens. There's an elevation here that doesn't really come through in this aerial photo. And because it is the natural drainage basin, the territory remains wet, soft, and nearly impossible to build on. For over 100 years, farmers harvested salt hay and shellfish and moved across it on a very rickety causeway, Strong's Causeway, or on light draft boats. The only way from Flushing on the east side of the Meadowland to Manhattan was by ferry, and this retarded urban development in the greater Flushing area and kept industrial concerns off the bay. In the early 1900s, there had been attempts to industrialize this space. Proposals for a railroad passenger terminal, for an aviation field, for a dirt track speedway, and they all remained unrealized. The most successful development in Flushing Meadows was the ash dump. But it's there because of a Long Island city developer named Michael Degnon, who planned to build a port complex on the bay. Now, this is a man who was well known in Queens by the early 1900s because of his contracting work on the Williamsburg Bridge, on the Triborough subway, and on his Long Island City Industrial Park. And he wanted to replicate his success on Flushing Bay. But to do so, he realized he needed to turn marshland into solid land, into usable real estate, which is one of the classic touchstones of New York City growth, is making land in boggy places or making land in the harbor. And so Degnon had contracted with the city sanitation department and a company called the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company to collect ashes from downtown Brooklyn to use as landfill. So 1907, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company has a subsidiary that it creates to work with this man. It's going to be an individual partnership called the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company. And it begins transporting ash from downtown Brooklyn to this landfill in Queens. The New York Times watched this unfold and complimented the work. They called it a model arrangement that removed the worst of the ash pollution from downtown neighborhoods. It's a proliferation in this moment of coal-burning furnaces that is creating a sanitation crisis for city streets. And so the dump is a positive environmental solution to an ash problem in Brooklyn. By 1916, Degnon seems to be on the road to success. He's constructed 2 miles of bulkhead along the northern edge of the bay, and substantial landfill was underway. But when the nation enters into the First World War the following year, in 1917, the project loses momentum, and he eventually defaults on his loans and loses the property to the city. Even after that happens, the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company continues dumping operations. They've got an in. We're going to talk about what their in is, but you can guess in the 1930s what that's going to be. Over 26 years, the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company deposits an estimated 50 million cubic yards of ash across about 300 acres at the northern edge of the marsh. It's covered with not just ash though, because the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company is indiscriminate about what it picks up. Over time, the ash dump, which is supposed to be sanitary landfill, it's supposed to be just ash, also includes things like rusting boilers and baby carriages and car bodies, and it takes on a surreal moonscape quality. This is Mount Corona, the largest of the ash heaps. And as this dump grows, public opinion starts to shift from the early praise that the Times had endowed on the area. So 20 years after the Corona dump opens, Fitzgerald has declared it a dismal scene. And it isn't bringing development. Excepting a municipal asphalt plant at the Tidewater and a handful of industrial buildings that are literally built on stilts, the marsh remains largely empty. The only adjacent development is Gasoline Alley, which is again, reminiscent of the Great Gatsby, but which comes along the edge of the dump, and it's Gasoline Alley, and it's under an ash plague. It often gets breezes of the ash coming across it. So Roosevelt Avenue and the Long Island Railroad Yard, where that is today, is this exact space. And dumping operations continue in Flushing Meadows with only minor changes until the mid-30s, when dump protests and a growing demand for the reform of machine politics bring it to a conclusion and finally see some action. Now, when I started this research, I was very much hoping that I would find community activism against this dump. But what I realized is that this environmental setup and the way that the breezes move through this space meant there was never cohesive community action against the dump. Sometimes, what's the fancy housing down there at the bottom? Oh my God. Thank you. I'm looking at you. I do this to my students, like, what's the word I want? Yes, sometimes Forest Hill Gardens gets a breeze coming in and feels the problems of the ash and the smoke from the fires. Sometimes it's up in downtown Flushing. Sometimes it's even in the East Bronx, depending on the way the winds are blowing, but it's jurisdictionally complex. Queens and the Bronx are not working together across the boroughs. There's no community activism. It's really the fight against machine politics and corruption, because the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company, like the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, are Tammany corporations. John Fishhooks McCarthy is the man who runs Corona Dump. Apparently he was called Fishhooks because when the bill came, he would hook his hands in his pockets and never offered to pay for anything. And you're not going to be surprised to hear that it's going to be Mayor LaGuardia, who runs on an anti-corruption fusion ticket, who is going to dismantle the Corona Dump. On January 1st, when his government ends Tammany's 20-year monopoly on Brooklyn refuse removal, waste disposal is placed under municipal operation. In the same moment, in the mid-30s, the New York World's Fair Corporation will organize, or incorporate rather, and will agree with the city to jointly redevelop Flushing Meadows. And the lack of infrastructure is a problem in this area. After the city acquires the territory, journalists go out and city officials go out to survey what's there. And this is why we only have an estimate of how much ash has been dumped, because no one took any, there are no records. And one journalist went out and declared the area formidable barriers to the further growth and development of Queens. And they saw Mount Corona as really a monument to the indifference, this is their words, and careless city management of Flushing Meadows. So this is the unplanned periphery that characterizes so much of New York's waterfront in the late 19th and early 20th century. Land is cheap, regulatory oversight is minimal, if non-existent, and marshland is valuable as a dumping site, not as developable real estate or for any type of ecological benefit. But the undeveloped quality of Flushing Meadows is also a boon. It's a basis of the territory's temporary disfiguration, but it's also the basis of its future prospects. The open marshland, despite the dump, is the last great open space left anywhere near the geographic center of New York City at this time. And it's this second perspective that is important, I think, that points to the ideological reframing underway in the Meadows in the 1930s. It's a reframing that looks at a wasteland as an opportunity to experiment in city building technology and what I would call environmental engineering. And it's there that business elites from Manhattan and public works officials would chart a new course for the urban periphery in the name of the World's Fair. So the powerful World's Fair Corporation will effectively pioneer the first comprehensive environmental cleanup in New York City. The lease between the Fair Corporation and city, Robert Moses, these are his words, once explained, reflects the predominant idea of reclamation. Reclamation is a popular term in the 1930s, but during the New Deal, it's most often associated with things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. The controlling of water, the reclaiming of land. Often it's about controlling rivers or bringing water to dry places, but reclamation can also reflect the draining of marshland in stable territory as well. And so reclaiming the shore is something that Moses used, means to reshape the marshland to meet his interests, to meet contemporary needs for natural resources, which for Moses is clean park space. I love this image of Robert Moses from the New York City Parks Department library because he has parks in green, which are completed, you can see Central Park, and parks in orange, which he wants to build, right? So you can see the Triborough Bridge, underneath the Triborough Bridge on Randall's and Ward Islands are still separated, and Flushing Meadow Parks is right here. It's on his mind as something he wants to do. When a park for Flushing Meadows is announced, reporters declare it impossible. They nickname the site the Mad Meadows. There's no precedent in the city for a park construction like this. Now, it's not to say the city hasn't built some enormous parks. The largest park in the city is Pelham Bay Park, nearly 2,000 acres, but it had been pieced together in the 1880s from a series of old coastal estates. Literally no landscaping had been required. They took down some fences, parkland. Central Park, the 843 acres of Central Park, is completely man-made, but at least that was solid ground. Flushing has neither of these attributes to recommend it to park building. Moses knew of the challenge of transforming Flushing Meadows and Corona Dump into a modern park because he's been trying to do it for the first half of the 1930s. In the mid-1930s, he had used Triborough Bridge Authority, TBA monies, to extend Grand Central Parkway west as a bridge approach road. The TBA was patterned after the Port Authority of New York, and it's a standalone government agency, which is one of the reasons that Robert Moses was so influential in New York City, because it has an independent operating budget that doesn't depend on state or local funding, which means it doesn't depend on state or local politicians' oversight or municipal credit limits. And so it has the power to issue its own bonds and to take in tolls. And in doing this, the agency can build and operate and maintain facilities through toll receipts and bond receipts. And so he tries to build an approach road. I mean, it's kind of far away, right? As this is an approach road, Olive Steinway. But that's what he claims it is, and he gets away with it. And so he tries to build this road and does run through Corona Park, golf, and country club grounds, but most of it is just a track through the marsh or through the dump. And this makes Moses mad. He says that it's a brief visual and olfactory oasis that offers the pathetic beauty and fragility of a single rose in a dung heap. He makes his argument to the city, and the city says, the Depression has strapped the budget of the city to such an extent that they cannot and they refuse to allocate any additional funds to reclaim the land abutting his highway. And so that's why he was so interested when McEnany comes to him and says, let's build a fair here, because he's been working on it already. And so the funding afforded by the fair would make possible the transformation of this Meadowlands. Now Moses liked to use the word reclamation, and he called for it in a way, in the same moment that he called for the need for scientific expertise. It's the idea of reclamation is caught up within an expert reclaiming unruly nature to be more useful. So nature that is being wasteful as a natural resource in some way, to be put to use in something that humans can appreciate. And this is very typical of the way marshland is talked about in New York City. New Yorkers, Helen Keller lives out by Flushing Meadows and writes in her diary about the experience of being in the Meadowland and how the nature it gives to her, and she's very appreciative of it. But most people say, oh, dumps are marshy. Marshes can absorb more trash than solid land. Marshes are good for dumps. They can absorb trash, and that's the more kind of utilitarian aspect of the ecosystem. So this waterlogged land needs to be turned into dry, buildable real estate, and that requires the redistribution of the ashes in the dump. The process to visualize the fair site is laborious. The meadow mat is basically like a custard pie. It's got a crust, I know not what you thought was coming. It's got a crust on the top, and then it's full of accumulations of tidal silt and kind of muddy tidal deposits. The meadow mat is what the Meadowlands in New Jersey looks like today. And because Flushing Meadows had originally been a bay, it is 80 feet deep of this kind of, if you will, this like chocolate pudding on the inside of the pie. And then the crust is anywhere from 3 to 7 feet deep. And it's created through root structure and their accumulation of organic decomposing material, reeds, and grasses. And so that's why it's so hard to build on this, because anytime you try to press on one side, like a waterbed, it will move to the other, and there's really unstable terrain. They realize that the nature of the Meadowlands is the #1 problem to construction challenges, but it's also a solution. The fair builders decide to stop thinking about taking up this meadow mat. You can see here they're trying to aerate it. It's super acidic as well, which makes it really hard to grow any kind of grass in it as well. And they say, let's not mess with it or try to take it up, but leave it in its natural state, and to think of it as being basically water. And so everything that they decide to build is going to be built as if they're piers. And so every major building on the fairground is put on pilings. They're fir and spruce pilings, and some are 80 to 100 feet long. The pile drivers needed to do this, to build these foundations, deliver 15,000-pound blows to hammer the timbers through this kind of jelly in the center of the Meadowlands. Every single building in Flushing Meadows has to have these. So there are more than 500 pilings underneath the perisphere, which is the fair's enormous, iconic globe. This is not the same as the unisphere, although I've been told that it's on the same pilings. I've never seen proof of that, but, you know, if you'd like to believe that. It's a fair, I've been told by local Queens historians that that's the case. And so 500 pilings support this 4,650-ton perisphere, and it's designed so that the mud underneath of Flushing Meadows doesn't have to move at all. It can continue to act like the liquid that it tends to be. And so here we can see the construction of the perisphere and the trilon. These are the symbols of the World's Fair. We'll keep coming back to these. You might say, I've never heard of a trilon. It's because they make this word up. It's a tri-sided obelisk for the fair. It's supposed to look modern, like the future. Now the grading of the ash dump and filling in of the ash, they spread those ashes out, they put the pilings in, part of a long history of landmaking in New York, but mostly this has happened without municipal oversight by private companies like the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company. Here we see the first time the city is going to regulate and to have oversight of planners and engineers. Particularly Columbia University is instrumental in sending the very first generation of soil mechanic engineers out to Flushing to work on the science behind it. There's also going to be a new nature on top of this mat. So the mat is rebuilt underneath and reconfigured as a system underneath, but also on top. And these are from the Gilbert D. Clark papers. Major Gilbert D. Clark is probably the foremost public landscape in the 1930s by the time he does this work. He's made a name for himself, particularly working for Robert Moses. He's a landscape architect on call for the City Parks Department, and he doesn't work alone. He also works with Frances Cormier, who's famous for her Westchester and gilded Gold Coast estates, and the architect Amar Emery II, who's also a modernist and celebrated for both country estates and public works. He does the colonnade at Orchard Beach in the Bronx. So these are people who have worked for Moses before, and they envision a great park here, and these are the two diagrams. Flushing Meadows has been a park been talked about being a park since the early 1900s. Moses has had his eye on it since he's been working on Long Island in the 1920s, and it's going to be the fair that makes it possible, or in theory makes it possible to realize, and it will become the keystone of Queens' park system. So the meadow mat underneath this landscape is reconfigured or reimagined. The landscape on top is now a different type of nature. It is no longer marshy, it no longer has muskrats, it doesn't have reedy grasses, but it's going to be an American Versailles. Does it sound like Robert Moses said that? This idea that it would have tree-lined alleys, both a formal European and a formal Japanese garden, and then they end up having to dig 2 lakes because they don't have enough landfill to fill in the rest of the marsh. And they're like, and we need a lake, yeah, that's what that's for. And they claim it will be for migratory birds, but mostly it's because they can't afford to buy any more landfill to go into the marshland. All right, so the space, the environment has been reimagined. The last thing to make a successful fair is going to be opening Queens to the public. And by that I mean by opening the Queens through public transportation. There's going to be subway expansion, but the real gemstone of transit here are going to be highways. The World's Fair Corporation and city leaders both believe that the fair's success depends on accessibility by car. The East River must be bridged more than once if they can. So the northernmost bridge across the East River between Manhattan and Long Island was built in 1906, the Queensboro Bridge. It's the only automobile route off of Long Island north of the Lower East Side. It gives me terror every time I think about it. And city engineers have been thinking about a Triborough Bridge between the Bronx, Queens, and Manhattan since 1916, but they have terrible timing. The date that they finally begin the structure is October 25th, 1929. This is Black Friday. It's part of the 7-day collapse of the American economy. So they have like a shovel-ready ceremony, and then everything goes to hell on Wall Street. And following that crash, there is no money. And the bridge remains incomplete, or really just in its planning stages, until 1933, when Moses successfully forwards the legislation to create the TBA to finish this project. So you can see it here. So this is kind of looking east to northeast. This is the Bronx, Manhattan, and these are the 2 islands before they've been filled to create one. It opens July 11th, 1936, the largest bridge complex in the world, 16 miles of approach roads and overpasses. And it represents Moses' triumph, right? He knows this, and he puts his office in the casements of the Triborough Bridge on this island. He says, this is the center of my empire, and just in case you forgot, here where I'm headquartered. And now it's not that people haven't been thinking about large-scale road building schemes or park building schemes in New York before him. It's his eye for resource gathering in the 1930s. It's a coalescing of 2 moments. Because Moses, such as his nature, boasted of his crucial role as a liaison between agencies responsible for park and road building. And he called the TBA the warp on the metropolitan loom that allowed him to, quote, weave together loose strands and frayed edges of New York. And he's right, the TBA gives him a lot of money, but it's really the depression on top of the TBA that helps him do this. When New Deal relief becomes available, the city and Moses benefit. The intertwined goals of the New Deal, economic recovery, job creation, government protection, public works, transforms the American landscape between 1933 and 1942, and Moses masterfully directs New Deal funds towards his public works agenda. First through the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, then through the Public Works Administration, which, just in case you weren't confused, is eventually reorganized as the Works Progress Association. So the WPA being the most long-lasting and substantial of them. This is from the Living New Deal. If you've never seen this website, I super recommend it. This represents the real transformative quality of New Deal money in New York. New York City alone sees more than 770 unique public works through funding. 1 out of every 7 WPA dollars is spent in New York City. And Moses is the man who siphons them. He will oversee the largest urban park and parkway program of the New Deal. The New Deal and WPA workers are on Flushing Bay building sewage treatment plants like the one at Bowery Bay. They're at Orchard Beach and LaGuardia Airport. $41 million, it's the largest, the single most expensive New Deal project, or WPA project nationwide. When the WPA is organized, New York City receives its own unit, independent from the state, and effectively becomes the 49th state of Depression-era relief. And the Parks Department receives the most of these funds in the city. Borough presidents get the second highest proportion to fund infrastructure in streets and sewers. And this is a major turning point for the city because the city becomes flush with cash. The New Deal programming, right, FDR's Keystone Project, favors shovel-ready projects by any state, municipal, or municipal agency on public property. And due to the work of city planners in New York, the Regional Plan of New York and its environs from the late 1920s, Moses' work for the City Department of Parks, or Long Island State Park Commission, the city is awash in plans looking for funding, right? Think about Moses' idea for Flushing and the Grand Central Parkway extension. And so the funding comes in. At its peak in January and February of '36, WPA's monthly outlay, in New York City is about $23 million a month. LaGuardia loves it. 13% of the municipal budget is all he needs to put towards physical improvements, and the federal government pays the rest. The question I think is something to keep in the back of your mind is, what was the maintenance, what was the long-term maintenance plan for all of this funding? But we're living in the moment here. Moses approved of this. He approved of New Deal funds, and the TBA, he says, at last it was possible to get something accomplished on a great scale, because little plans and accomplishments are of no use in the metropolitan community. This is my favorite thing of archival material. A second bridge is built for the fair, and this is for the Bronx Whitestone Bridge. It's built under budget and opens in advance of its scheduled date. Imagine that. And it's because, as the fair proclaimed, all roads lead to the fair in '39. The Parks Department estimated Flushing Meadow Park to be within a 15-minute drive of 5 million people and an hour drive of 10 million people with modern parkways and bridges. And so to prepare for expected traffic from New England, the TBA plans a second bridge. And that's the Bronx Whitestone Bridge. It opens April 29th, 1939, the day before the fair opens on April 30th. Moses thought this was, quote, logical and inevitable as part of the Great Beltway program of Parkways for Long Island. I love this because this is for a party that the local community has to celebrate the opening of the bridge and the fair. And you can see said Trilon and Perisphere in the front, and then these are the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx finally greeting one another across the bay. And Pearl Levinson has graced us with her interpretation of Walt Whitman to capture this achievement. This is the official poem of the New York World's Fair. This was a public contest that anyone could write in their poem, and Pearl wins. And you can see what I mean when I think that she's been inspired by another Long Island native. Here on island, oh, connect here for all points of your travel, with many bridges extending, Triborough, Queensboro, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Whitestone, iron harps suspended. Here at Hub of Island, with many spokes converging, this is the achievement, this is tomorrow, the island no longer insular. Which is not so bad. So the World's Fair opens on April 30th, 1939, the 150th anniversary of George Washington's presidential inauguration on Wall Street. There is a large plaster statue of George Washington on the main fairground. But besides from this date and that statue, the fair is not interested in the past. It is the world of tomorrow, that is its theme. This is an image from Midtown, from one of the skyscrapers in Midtown. You can see again the white color-coded city out here in Flushing. I have to be honest with you, we would never have been able to see this. This is an infrared picture because of the air pollution of 1930s New York. So unless the sky was very clear, you wouldn't have been able to have this view. But
is it better now? Could you have seen it now?
Yeah, you would have been able to see it now. EPA has made this possible. But it doesn't exist, right? It's all come down. All of this is temporary, except the only permanent building at the fair is the New York State Pavilion, which is where the Queens Museum is today. Visitors who arrived to the fair by car, or maybe by a newly extended subway, disembarked on wide wooden boardwalks that lined that were lined with flags leading up to the entrance. And this is maybe my favorite explanation of what that feeling was like to come to the fair. If under the flags, close to the railing, you stop and look down, you will see a remnant of the original marsh, thick slime and green springing grass, from which all else has been at one time redeemed. From dumps to glory is the phrase of the guidebook, before me lies the world of tomorrow. And from dumps to glory is the theme that the city uses to explain what has happened in Flushing. Now, New York is not the first World's Fair to construct permanent civic improvements in its host city. 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition does very similar work on Chicago's waterfront. But it stands apart from predecessors in the scale of operations and the fact that these permanent civic improvements have been planned in advance and have been codified by legislation and contract. And the official guidebook of the fair continued to point this out to visitors. They said that the building of the world of tomorrow theme is exemplified in Queens as you come to the fair. They said, quote, not only is a permanent city plan to be the result, but facilities and highways and sewers and water mains and airports and water transportation and transit has been realized in the course of the construction of the fair. Right? And so while it has a futurist theme, it is very much grounded in the contemporary forces of land use planning, of New Deal funding, and municipal investment in engineering, particularly experimental engineering. Now, the view of Moses and his New Deal cohort celebrated the regionalism and these large-scale public works. And they are influential ideas, as you can see here, but they're not without limits. And the afterlife of the fair site reveals this. The World of Tomorrow closed on October 26, 1940. The following day, 1,200 demolition workers swarmed the ground. It's just opened seasonally in the summer for the 2 years the fair runs, 39 and 40. There are 400 buildings that need razing and dismantling to turn fair site into Flushing Meadows Park, which had been part of the contract. The park is scheduled to open in 1942. But the debris of dismantled buildings, plowed up pavement, the metal framework that's a lot of the inside of these plaster buildings remains. The landscape is slowly dying of the planted flowers. The Fair Corporation doesn't make profit. The first $2 million in revenue had been earmarked for park construction, but the fair only gets about 40 cents of a return on every dollar invested. Without profits to fund the park, and with New Deal reserves evaporating, the park remains unfinished. New Deal funds made this park possible in 1935, but by 1940, America's a very different place. There is not money for funding when there is of parks when there is a war effort. In fact, a lot of the steel inside the World's Fair buildings is taken apart and sent to Norfolk, Virginia for emergency housing. For the Navy base there, for the emergency housing. So the park is never finished, but the $59 million that had been spent here had already remade Flushing Meadows and its ecosystem. And the restructured nature of the fair site really helps to obscure this innovation and this money. Scholarship on Moses' career is vast, and it really focuses on his particularly in the 30s, on his parks and his arterial highway projects. But he's very self-aware that he's thinking about the city's peripheral waterfronts, as much as he was about roads and parks. Spaces seen as natural to us from 2019, such as a park, are very much mediated by Moses' vision of what a modern waterfront should look. He declared that he was an environmentalist before there were environmentalists. He said, on the Upper East River and Flushing Bay, we were busy salvaging the environment. And there is a way in which this represents environmental ideals, but they're ideals of the 1930s. Reclamation does not mean attempting to restore untouched or natural state of this bay. A reclaimed coast does not address native flora or fauna. It does not address, or maybe it assumes, better to say, it assumes mastery of drainage and tidal patterns that are proving to be increasingly untenable 100 years, for 100 years looking towards the future. And so I think that the history of the fair building process underscores the importance of engineering and planning, and something that's very much seen as a cultural phenomenon, the world of tomorrow. The fair makes visible how planners and public works officials merge technology and ideas of nature to build what modernity is, and they decide to put it in Queens. It will be the outer boroughs of the city that face the future, not the older 19th century city of Manhattan. Urban growth in Queens is going to alter a number of thresholds between the regional city and its environs. The suburbs of Nassau and Levittown are just around the corner. It reshapes the borderland, so between city and suburb, but also the borderland between land and sea on the Upper East River and Flushing Bay. It also de-emphasizes political boundaries, I think, through interjurisdictional public works. And so from his base from his office at the base of the Triborough Bridge in the East River, Moses is coordinating this vision of the modern city and modern Queens. The fair is both an instrument of urban growth and regional planning, and it is a proclamation of modernity in a time of uncertainty. It is also, in the end, the erasure of a gritty in-between Queens, an urban periphery that is unregulated, best captured in the ash heaps of Flushing, and made into space for an expanded vision of suburban growth that would perhaps best articulate the world of tomorrow on Long Island. Thank you.
Sustained applause. Before maybe questions from the Queens enthusiasts, could you sketch out some of the other chapters of the book so we understand better?
Let's watch out, whiplash here. So I want to put this up to help us understand. So my first chapter looks at city building with two people who we might not always think of city builders, William Steinway and P.T. Barnum. These are men with money in the 1840s through 1880s who decide that cities aren't being built the way they want in this metropolitan quarter, and they're going to do it themselves. Steinway moves and builds a company town in Queens, Steinway Village, and P.T. Barnum creates what he calls his pet city, Bridgeport, Connecticut. He always says, I have Bridgeport on the brain, that's what he likes to say. And they both effectively create master plans through benefactor city planning. So it looks about kind of localized investment in urban planning before there was such a thing as a city planner. And then the next chapter looks at the integration of the South Bronx into New York City. The South Bronx is annexed in two sections, 1870s and then 1895, pre-consolidation. And I look at the different ways that the city is integrated, through streets, through the Harlem River Canal, through the park system in the Bronx. The third, I said, what happens next? The third chapter thinks about regular people who aren't rich like Steinway, or who aren't influential like Andrew Haswell Green, who's really influential in the South Bronx, and places, this is Clawson Point's amusement park, where Harding Park is today, and where Soundview Park is today. It's the best example. Or Steinway's bathing pavilion, LaGuardia Airport, you might spend some time here. And then Throb's Neck, the bungalow colonies, and how people without money, without influence, create patterns of leisure along shore that effectively shape urban form. The next chapter looks at county-level park commissions, Long Island State Park Commission, Westchester County Park Commission, and how the rise of park planning in the 1920s takes this region by storm. And the idea of what a modern city looks like is actually imagined first in the suburbs of Nassau and Westchester, and then brought back into the city in the 30s with Moses. And then the other chapter is about the rich people who don't like any of this, and say, I'm not sure I want to be integrated into a regional city at all, and fights against state park plans in Connecticut and in Nassau County on the Gold Coast. There's a question, yes?
I've also written about the history of Flushing Meadows Corona Park, and I have a question that you may be able to answer that has eluded me. Can you go back to that slide with Moses and the map?
Yeah, okay.
If you look at the orange area where Flushing Meadow Park is, the northern part, if you look to the right of that, there's a diagonal line.
This bit.
That diagonal line is Willets Point Boulevard. that's because the original Willets Point was Fort Tommy. It belonged to the Willets family when they had a farm at the time of the Civil War.
Okay.
They sold that land. Okay. What we call Willets Point now is a complete misnomer. It's that white area to the right of the orange area.
Yes.
And the reason it's called that is because of Willets Point Boulevard. But we can, all the planners, all the government people call this Willets Point, and it drives me crazy. Anyway, what I'm asking you, that area was never part of the park.
No.
That area was used for the construction of the park. That's where all the big construction firms who were working on the park parked there pretty much and used that space. How did that space become privatized? After the Second World War, that becomes privatized and then became the chop shops. How did that become privatized?
So you've just set me up to say that my book ends in 1940. But I do not know the answer to that. And they use condemnation and public takings to get this land. It makes people wildly angry. And they're really strictly zone land use around the park. So no one else is allowed to set up construction. No one else is allowed to set up RV or campgrounds or hot dog shacks. It's all very tightly controlled by the city and zoning. But I don't know how that flips in the end. Sorry about that. You'll have to just continue. Stay up late at night thinking.
Does the Flushing Creek have a future the way Newtown Creek has a present and a future?
Well, what's left of it, right? So Flushing Creek ran, you can kind of almost see it in the dark, meandering through this meadowland. And when they built the park ground, they cut it off from its tidal access. And so it was once a salty creek, but they put in bulkheading to separate the ecological pattern of bay and creek. And so now it's a freshwater creek, and it feeds the two lakes. Willow Lake being, down here in the park. And so its ecosystem is entirely renovated, and in fact it now flows north rather than south. Because originally there had been hopes that the Army, people have been asking since the 1880s for the Army Corps of Engineers to dredge all the way down to Jamaica. Queens wanted to steal the shipping of Manhattan. And so then the city representatives in Albany were always like, no way, we don't want the Army Corps. And they fought back and forth about trying to bypass the East River and Harlem waterfronts. So it's like a puzzle piece that is now removed from the system of which it was once a part. It's still drainage though, which can cause tricky problems in this area. This is still where the water wants to run.
In fact, in both World's Fairs, doesn't it feed the pools?
These lakes here. It feeds the lakes in particular.
Okay.
Yeah. We didn't get to talk about it, but the sewer system underneath this is really awesome. They built the largest sewer main that's ever been constructed up to this point. It's larger than the Holland Tunnel. All these really cool. And because they're trying to dry the lake out, so they try to dry the marsh out, so they have to collect all the rainwater that's coming through Queens and try to keep this dry. My students have told me that's not interesting, so. I don't know what they're talking about.
Gilbert Clark, is he the same one that gave us the Unisphere?
I can't imagine Gilbert Clark's still alive.
No, not today. But
No, in 64.
He was.
He was?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, sorry. Tell your eye doctor I apologize about that laser. Is he still alive? It must be the last thing he does. Who said it? Who knows? Yeah, is it the last thing he does?
I don't know if it's the last thing he
I
does.
thought so.
Because he's working in the 1920s in
Right.
Westchester.
Right.
So that means he's working in 64 as well?
Right. It was his
Yeah.
concept.
Well, he goes to war and he's in his 40s by the time he's in. I guess that's not that old now that I'm looking back on it.
Moses was 77 when
Yeah.
the fair was, so,
Yeah, Moses is obsessed about 64 because he never finishes his park and it's a thorn in his paw. He's determined, and that's why he wants that second World's Fair so much.
The firm of Clark and Rappuano continued much longer.
And their papers are huge. It continues to grow way past him, but in the 20s, it's really his vision.
And Rappuano, I think gets credit for popularizing the London plane trade.
They're all over the public housing projects everywhere.
they're perfect.
Very well done.
It's a different story, but it's a perfect tree for an urban ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
What caught your interest on this? And your book is much broader. I can't wait to get my hands on it. But what caught your interest for the?
Well, it brings a lot of the things I was interested in. I was interested in the people who were using this space beforehand in peripheral and unregulated uses of the waterfront. And my earlier chapters look at so this is Steinway over here and the factory, but also there's an amusement park. It's originally called Bowery Bay Beach, but then they think the Bowery sounds like people drinking in Manhattan, so they changed the name. Steinway himself changes it to North Beach, but it's still full of people drinking. It's a German amusement park, and I say that not just to be facetious, but his partner is George Ehret, which is one of the largest beer manufacturers of German York Upper East Side, and so he partners with George, and they build this. It's really a beer garden, and you can only have beer hall if you sell his beer, you sell Ehret's beer. But it's really fascinating. There's these Irish people, there's a Kells family, for example, who are out here, and it's really working class. They have a tent, and they have a 15-minute running set of kind of vaudeville, and it's free to come in, and they'll sell you beer or like sarsaparilla soda. And so families would picnic. People would, if you don't have enough money to say, go to Steinhagen Villa, which is where Steinway and his friends would eat in North Beach, you could go and bring a picnic lunch and go in here, and it cost you nothing. If you didn't buy a soda, they didn't kick you out. And it's all still grassland out here, and they would sell you like a mini keg and take it out into the fields and tap it for you. And so I was really interested in these vernacular ways that working class people were trying to access the shore, people who couldn't even afford the trip down to the south shore of Long Island, right? So these people who were like, the beaches are much nicer on the south side of Long Island, but they can't afford the time away or the cost to get there, so they make do with these really, it's an estuary, it's muddy, it's odoriferous at low tide, it's rocky. It's not a place that necessarily says, come swim here, but for the people whose margins for leisure, in terms of economics or in time, are narrow enough, it works for them. So that's how I originally came here, and I was interested about how it all disappeared. Because they knocked down the old amusement park to build LaGuardia Airport. So it's sitting there and rotting, and part of it is, right, they're selling beer here in the teens, the Germans own it. The temperance movement and prohibition knocks this park out. George Ehret is American born, but he's in Germany when the war breaks out, the first war breaks out, World War breaks out, and the federal government confiscates his property as alien property. It's like, I was born here. But your last name is so German, and you have terrible timing in vacations. And so they take his property, and so I have an oral history where you can hear it on the tape, and the guy being interviewed goes, and it disappears. So I was interested about what happened to that space, and that's how I ended up rolling into this. I had thought that my last chapter was going to be about forecasting suburbia on Long Island. That was the end of the regional city that I was looking towards by 1940, but then I realized that it was much more interesting what was happening underneath the fair and in preparation for it. It was much more interesting to me as someone who was interested in planning and environment than necessarily the corporate production. We didn't talk about it, but Democracy and GM's Futurama are here, and they're the most popular, and they're literally selling you cars and highways for Long Island. So it really, I thought that's what I would write about, but then I found out about that sewer system.
So are there issues today on this property that are the result of the way it was filled?
Yes, the lakes don't have any natural drainage. Algae is a continual problem in these lakes, and standing water is a continual problem in these lakes. And they continue to silt up. So to maintain them as lakes, you have to continually dredge them. They are not natural water features in any stretch of the imagination. And you might have seen this in the news, when tide is high or when there's a storm, the East River wants to enter into this space, right? It has always been a place that salt water came, and it continually wants to, with really terrifying repercussions for the airport.
And what about the pilings that were put there originally? They probably were all wood.
They were all wood, but as long as they're not exposed to air, they're fine, right? As long as they're not exposed to air or tides. So, and actually for a long time, the pilings it's really great if your water body is really polluted with because if you have an oxygen level of 0, which the Hudson River used to be, your pilings can't degrade because there's no marine life that can live. So the Tappan Zee Bridge they're just rebuilding, or just finishing now, up the Hudson. For 50 years, they were like, well, the Hudson is ecologically dead, that's bad. But good news is, there's no boring marine life to eat into these wooden piers. In fact, in Manhattan in the early 1800s, some of the wharf proprietors suggest poisoning the river because it costs so much to rebuild on the Hudson because it's got a high tide and it keeps exposing them. And they're like, these boring marine animals are bad for economics. Can we throw some chemicals in here? And then there's enough sewage they don't have to because it eats up all the oxygen and then they can't live.
So they didn't believe in wetlands as a natural means of maintaining the ecological system. They just wanted to change it.
That is so far away. Like the term ecology is here. Right? German natural scientists have been thinking about ecology by this point, for sure. And it comes up once in a while, but not in the sense that it's used today by landscape architects or city design or city planners. Wetlands are land that should be more profitable. And Steinway talks about wastes of land, wastes of marsh that he fills in, so does P.T. Barnum. And even Frederick Law Olmsted, who says, oh, I recognize the aesthetic quality of maybe a fen landscape, only when controlled. Only if that's the best return on investment. But wetlands are just places for trash because it's like a sponge. It can absorb so much more trash than solid land can. And so that's what they're used for across the city. Up until, it's not until the EPA is created that you have to see what fill of a wetland does to the ecosystem. So up until the 1970s, you can fill a wetland as an urban planner or as a private citizen with no oversight from the government.
None at all.
None at all. No. And when the Army Corps of Engineer comes in the 1970s and looks at this environment from the Harlem to Upper East River to Throgs Neck, they say it's not even worth doing an environmental assessment, there's no environment. Which I would think is also a problematic vision of what environment is. But that's how altered this landscape is. But that's really its bottom in the 20th century.
There's not like a Superfund site or anything like that.
No, it's Willets Point is a greenfields site. And Willets Point is fascinating. If you're not all, there's 2 of us in the room we're into it, but it's fascinating. It's not connected to the city's sewer system. The sewer system is piecemeal out there. The auto parts yards have been dumping oil into this ground since at least the 19-teens. And so there's long-term contamination in the soil here. And
Are they still out there,
Yeah.
Some of them.
A little bit. It's much scaled. And I think, honestly, the Bloomberg administration had been very interested in this waterfront as the next waterfront, particularly as Flushing booms as a center of skyrises and malls and new glass, tall, kind of dense buildings. This is on the city's site. You see it in Plan 2020, Plan NYC Vision 2020, rather, that Manhattan's waterfront is pretty much built out. It's again a moment where if the city's going to experiment with coastal design, it's going to be in the outer boroughs. And so this was on the Bloomberg Vision 2020, and you might have been hearing more about Clawson Point, Soundview, Park, the ferry system. All of this is being rethought in the 21st century. But they are, again, bandying about this idea of reclamation in ways that and resiliency in ways that I am suspicious of. When Bloomberg says it so many times, you start to feel like, what do you think that means? Because they're interested in resiliency to the point, resiliency to preserve existing real estate values. Resiliency can also mean managed retreat, which is like a dirty word for coastal landscapes. That the idea that the seas are going to return to places seas have been traditionally, and that the city should be considering managed retreat of moving infrastructure and people, and anyone who owns real estate isn't interested in that. Imagine.
Since we've tipped into politics and history, it seems like a good time to break up into
So I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum, and how many people are new to the space tonight? Anybody? Well, welcome. Maybe students or something? Friends, great. Attracted to our what is a monthly authors talk, and so I invite you to look at our website and come back every month for yet another choice work on New York City history, skyscraper history, New York urbanism, global urbanism. And as a matter of fact, our next speaker is over in that corner right there, Zachary Violet, who will speak next Tuesday. In the first, it happens to be a book talk, but it's also the first of the series of programs that go with this exhibition that I hope you'll have a chance to look at after the talk. Called Housing Density, that looks at the history of housing in New York, from tenements to towers, focusing especially on public housing, but also on the kind of juxtaposition of a private market model from the perspective, and I should say perspectives, of density, because it tries to show you how there's more than one kind of density, population density, but also lot coverage and a percentage. So we think that the exhibition raises some interesting issues when you look at the kind of two models of public and private, and that lecture series, which has its second piece next Thursday, so we haven't had a chance to, our MailChimp account was overloaded for today, so we couldn't send out the notice that we just finished for today that will alert you to the rest of the programming. But as of next week, Zachary's book on the decorated tenement, a really excellent and revisionist study of looking at tenements not from the perspective of housing reform, but of immigrant entrepreneurship. Will launch that kind of alternative narrative that explores how the multitudes of New York got housed across the decades. And the second of the evenings will be Richard Pluntz and James Sanders and myself talking about the early 20th century models of private market models of garden apartments, and then inner city, high-rise, high-density, Tudor City, London Terrace, and a few other models that were accomplished before the Depression hit, and then we'll go on to explore public housing through the 30s through the 1960s. So we invite you to come back regularly. Tonight's talk by Schlichting. It's so hard to pronounce your name. I'm sorry. And it's not the first time I've not pronounced it well, because Kara is the second Schlichting, and the third Schlichting lecture in the series that we've done, because her father is Kurt. She's Carol with the K and he's Kurt with the K. Is also a historian, an urban historian, a historian of infrastructure. Some of you may have attended or know his books on Grand Central, a couple of books on Grand Central and the engineer William Wilgus, and the most recent one that we did talk about here on the Manhattan waterfront. And what a coincidence that waterfront should come into play in the subject of Kara's book, New York Recentered, which is an ironic title that she will begin to explain to you, a subtitle of which is Building the Metropolis from the Shore. So the water as a centering device for the activities of the riparian development, whether recreational or before that industrial, is the environmental history, the industrial history, the broad regional history that she explores in this book, which is very intentionally a revisionist work, a new narrative in order to see history in this alternative framework or focus or foci. Kara worked on this book as your dissertation at Rutgers University, which she completed in 2015. So it came out really quite quickly, and in this august series that is edited through the University of Chicago, which is called Historical Studies in Urban America. So this is a real feather in her cap, and we're delighted tonight to get a preview, which has been tailor-made to our audience in the kind of urban and 1930s theme of this exhibition. So, Kara Schlichting.
Yeah.